everyone. If you're here, that means you are watching the first video lesson on motivation and engagement. And I'm super excited to talk to you about this topic today because it's personally one of my favorites. So what I'm going to do is we are going to go through all of the notes that I've typed up in the Google document. And of course, you feel free to make a copy if you want to take your own notes or just like record any questions that you have. And then we'll go through that. And when we're done, just make sure that you leave a comment or tell me what you liked about it, tell me what you didn't like, if you agree, disagree. Like, I'm hoping to generate a lot of good discussion after the lesson, and of course, answer any questions that you may have. So let's get started. All right, so here we are for our lesson on motivation and engagement. When I sat down to write all of this out, I was thinking that the number one question that we were trying to answer for this topic is, how do we keep our students motivated and engaged when they're not with us? That's one concern we will have for the fall is, are we going to start with remote learning? Are we going to have half days, blended days? We don't really know yet. I mean, we would love it if school could just start back normally. However, with the way things are now, we don't know what's going to happen. So, in that case, if our students aren't going to be with us the entire time, we need to have some good background knowledge and some good strategies for keeping them motivated and engaged. And of course, there are many great technology tools that we're going to talk about later that will help us do this. However, I just think that it's really important to know some of that background knowledge on why the tech tools are motivating and engaging. And also, just because it's really interesting, this is a huge research area in psychology. Motivation has been researched since the 1950s and the 60s when psychologists were mostly using animal models, and since then, there has been many theories on motivation that have been developed. However, today we're just going to talk about a couple of the important ones for the classroom. And I hope that y'all have had some great discussion on the Padlet. I'm recording this before the class even starts, so there's no answers to see yet, but I hope that you all have had some time to think about the topics and maybe even read over this before you're listening to me. But this isn't a very important question to answer. School is changing, and I don't think that it's going to be the same as it was before spring break, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Okay, so to answer this question, I really think that now we have this great opportunity to harness the power of intrinsic motivation. So you might be thinking, what is that? And maybe you've heard of it before, but if you're not familiar with it, I'm going to explain it. So this type of motivation is that one that comes from inside of you. So that means that whatever is driving you, that fire that you feel, isn't coming from any sort of outside sources. You're not being influenced by rewards or punishments. You are doing what you are doing because you find it personally rewarding. So, for example, that could be like your job. And we hope that you love your job and you do it because it is personally rewarding. So, I want you to think back to some of the answers on the Padlet, and we'll talk about this in the comments in our discussion, which ones are more intrinsic and which ones are more extrinsic, which will bring us to extrinsic motivation, which is the opposite of intrinsic. Well, what this means is that this is a motivation that comes from outside sources. So this means that the causes of your behavior are being directed by outside forces, such as rewards or punishments. So this could mean that we are doing something in order to get a reward or in order to avoid a consequence or a punishment or something bad. So your behavior is being influenced by outside forces, and whatever you are doing is not personally rewarding. or interesting. Okay, so now we've kind of gone over what intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are. So now, how is intrinsic motivation going to help my students? Because at least in traditional education, a lot of what we do in the classroom has to do with external control factors, which we will address here in a little bit. When we perform a task because we are genuinely interested in it, so that's when I want you to think back to something that you are genuinely interested in, like something that, it matter if you got paid or if you didn't get paid, like you would do it anyway. But I think, even if we didn't get paid to work, most of us would still like do something. Okay. So this helps us develop a sense of autonomy or control over our learning. And now I have this word big right here because autonomy is very important when it comes to motivation. And it's important for motivation because, according to self-determination theory, which is a big umbrella theory of motivation that we're not going to get too much into, but one part of that theory says that we as humans have a psychological need to just maintain some control over our lives. And I think that makes sense because, we you do what you do because you like to do it and you want to do it, not necessarily because you're constantly being forced to do it. And autonomy is very important, and we're going to talk about more specific reasons why. In the traditional classroom, there are many external controls that are placed over students, and that's going to undermine their sense of autonomy, which can be demotivating. It's not always the case that students dislike school and that they don't want to learn. Just like with ourselves, like we're all interested in something. Well, so are the kids. Like every kid is interested in something. And yes, there might be those kids who just, no matter what you do, no matter what you try, they just, they don't want to learn. They don't want to do school. Like they'd rather be literally anywhere else than sitting in your classroom. But I mean, I would argue that those kids, they're still interested in something. So what this means for us is that, our in education, our roles are kind of shifting anyway, especially with the fact that we have the internet and every kid has a piece of technology and they can look up their answers. What this means is that our roles are shifting to more of guides and coaches. So instead of just trying to control and motivate with external rewards, we want to try to tap in to those interests that are already there. And this means that you can add in like real world application into your lessons that can really gauge those students' interests. And then that means the teacher is going from being the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. And that's just terminology I picked up from reading about some of the ed tech articles over motivation for students. Okay, so what happens is in the past, perhaps even now, teachers will try to force learning to occur, which doesn't always work out the way we want it to. And I totally understand, as I was a teaching assistant in graduate school and I had freshmen for intro to psychology. And I love psychology. If I were a teacher, I would teach psychology. And so like I would come to class like so ready, like so excited to present my lessons. And then a lot of them would just be like, so I get it. But yeah, you can't force learning to occur. Okay, so they feel like learning will not occur unless students are closely supervised, monitored, evaluated, and graded, which I would argue would be demotivating to me because, you think about it, if you've ever had a job where you've been micromanaged or your supervisor's always asking you questions, like looking to see what you're doing and then, evaluating you and all that, that's enough to demotivate pretty much anyone. But this can happen because of external pressures of high stakes testing, which definitely has an influence. Those of us who are trying to use intrinsic motivation to help our students in our classroom are swimming against a current. And I would argue now that we've had COVID, maybe we get a little more leeway because we're not so focused on high stakes testing and grades. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then also there are educators out there who do believe that motivation only occurs through external reinforcement instead of trying to find what the students are already interested and then facilitating from there. Because I would argue that every subject does have great real world application, and whether your student, because I mean, all students aren't going to be like 100% on board with every single subject. Like, they'll have some that they enjoy more than others, but that doesn't mean we can't gauge those kids and like see what they already know, see what they want to know, and then at least explaining to them the why. Why is this important? How can you apply this? So that can really help, if especially if the kid is your class is not their favorite subject, or it's something like they've struggled with in the past, and so they're like, oh, like, I just got to get through this class. So when students feel controlled, they're demotivated because their interests, passions, and joys for learning, they're replaced by feelings of anxiety or even boredom in a highly controlled classroom environment. But then again, so that happens, well, then it's just like a cycle. So then the teacher think, oh, okay, I have to make learning happen when what they're doing is demotivating the kids, but they don't realize it. And so they keep trying to do those strategies. And I'm definitely not saying a student should be allowed to control every single aspect of the classroom, because that would just be terrible. Then probably not everything you need to get done will get done. However, they do need a lot of structure and guidance from their teachers. So what I'm trying to get at is, if teachers use, so we'll call these autonomy supporting strategies right here. So that's very important. Rather than controlling strategies, this is going to help get those students motivated and engaged. And another great point that I need to add here is that not all extrinsic motivation is bad. And so the way I've kind of explained it earlier is that intrinsic is opposite of extrinsic. One's internal and one is external. However, there are degrees of there are degrees of extrinsic motivation, and some include autonomy to them. What I was talking about earlier is just pure controlling, no autonomy supporting at all extrinsic. But in fact, you do need a good balance of both, because while, like I was saying earlier, some things are more interesting to us than other things. However, especially with school, there might be like some classes we don't necessarily like, we don't want to take, but we have to have enough internal regulation to get through that. And you can help get your students more internally regulated and autonomous by using more intrinsic motivation factors. But we are constantly surrounded by outside pressures that are trying to pull us in different directions. And sometimes we need extrinsic motivation to help us get through boring tasks in order to achieve larger goals, such as taking a specific class to get the credit you need towards your degree. So, yeah, like you are studying what you love because it is personally rewarding to you. Like, I had a psychology degree, but one class I had to take was microeconomics. And that was one of the hardest classes I ever took. Like, the teacher that I had was the department head, and this was supposed to be an intro level class, but she was tough. And all the notes were in graphs and formulas and not words, and so it was really hard. But I ended up getting a B. And then years later, I got my psychology degree. So yeah, we sometimes we do need that. Another great example that I love is, playing music while you wash the dishes. Because while some of us might find it personally rewarding to wash dishes, I don't, and that's something I have to force myself to keep up with every single day. And so maybe like one thing we would do is play some music to like get us in the groove, and, especially if you have kids and you're teaching your kids, to do chores or having them help you out. Like, yeah, like let's get excited. So that would be like a good form of using extrinsic motivation to do something that could be boring. And I would argue that many times in education, there are some things we all find a little bit boring. Okay, so let's get down to the real meat of things. So, one of the main points that I'm really trying to get across is that in education, many of our practices and ways of thinking are centered around rewards and punishment, which is why using a lot of intrinsic motivation is one, it's against the current because it's not how the traditional paradigm of education is set up. And so that might be why it can be a little difficult to grasp at first, especially if you've never heard of it before or you are used to using rewards and punishments in your classroom. Okay, applied to education. So our model of education was built on old 20th century ideas that are still very prevalent in our system today. And I mean, you can even see those in work because along with, our education system being built on the factory model, there was something called scientific management and the whole 40-hour work week and everything. And like a lot of our research today says that just because you work 40 hours does not mean you're more productive if you work less time. That's a whole nother topic to get into. But the one thing that is prevalent is that, kids will not do school unless it's mandated. And I'm, like I said earlier, I'm sure you all have kids in your classes that just don't seem interested in learning or in education at all. So what do we do? Like, we have to get our kids to pass the STAR test. So one thing that a lot of teachers can leverage against their students are their grades. So, and that's like also a whole nother lesson in and of itself, but I do want to address it just because it's very important. So, like, grades can be used as rewards and punishments, which is not necessarily a good thing because one huge, hotly debated topic in education is like, do grades actually reflect learning? And most of the time, they do not. And this can come in the form of giving kids zeros for missing work, or also just giving kids extra credit for something just like bringing a box of tissues to school. And in my personal opinion, the way that I learned about it in school was, grades aren't really a reflection of how intelligent you are, how smart you are. It's a reflection of your ability to be trained because that's what we're doing is we're training kids to be compliant in our old paradigm of 20th century education. And in fact, my whole opinion of standardized testing is just, well, I'll get into that later. But yeah, so grades don't always reflect learning. By imposing external controls, we demotivate our students, and in turn, think that we have to impose those controls over them to motivate them. So that's just kind of a cycle that if you don't know that it's there and you don't recognize it, it's hard to see. Because you have kids in your class that they're bored or they're thinking about something else, and you're like, okay, class, like we have to get X, Y, and Z done. This is all going to be on the test, and they don't care. But they do. There are things that they do care about. And so that's one of the biggest challenges, just finding those things that they're interested in, that they care about, or if it's a class that they've struggled with in the past that they don't particularly enjoy, really explaining the why. Why is this important? Why do you need to know it? How does this apply to your life, to the real world? Well, I think you'll see a difference if we start putting some of those into our lessons. And I'm not saying that it's always the case, but more often than not, with the traditional school environment, grades do not reflect learning, and the pressures of high stakes testing and that whole you have to learn, you have to memorize X, Y, and Z. Okay, now that you know that, we have to memorize A, B, and C. And so there's no real connection there. It's just know this, know that. instead of more of like a big picture type of thing, which, you know, kills learning. And it's no secret that our system is flawed and that high stakes testing just doesn't work for anybody. But it's a reality that we have to deal with and that we have to address. But now is the best time to explore how intrinsic motivation can work for your students. And so here's where we're going to start talking a little bit more about our current situation with COVID. So I just want you to think about it. Like, we're changed forever, whether, we do end up going back to normal or not. Our students have missed like a significant portion of school, and they're already what we call digital natives. And so they're used to technology, and with the remote learning, they're not going to want to come back to class and be told to sit there, be quiet, do their worksheets, turn it in for a grade and whatnot. Like, it's going to be a lot different. And yes, like, a lot of harm was done. Our It's completely rattled our schools. It's completely rattled all of us. Like, I feel like none of us have felt normal since, before spring break. But I think that so much good can come out of it. And that's what I say about, staying positive. Like, it sounds cliche, just stay positive, make the best out of a bad situation. But it's true. Like, in all this craziness, maybe we could take advantage of some of the opportunities that the situation has presented us. So, in fact, like, some of what the articles that I've been reading have said that student engagement and productivity actually went up when students found out they didn't have to take their STAR test and that their grades weren't like as big of a deal as they would have been if school were in session. Because I mean, a lot of what we did was gave out completion grades because of the whole, issue of equity, and some students have their parents helping them, and some students don't. But really, that gives kids more room to breathe, so they can really like engage with the content and even explore their own interests in the process. Now that grades and STAR testing are not at the forefront of education, which, I'm sure once things, get back, when school gets back in the swing of things, and it starts to become normal, we start to have more of our students coming back to campuses. Like, yes, that's probably going to be the focus, but now it's not so much as of a focus as, us being able to serve as many students as possible and to prevent that loss of learning that's occurred with this whole situation. So with that being said, we can plan more creative, engaging, and student-centric lessons. When the fall semester starts, things are not going to be the same. We're possibly looking at a school week where students might be in class for a couple of days or even half days, or we might have some weeks where they're just doing remote learning only. Like, we don't know yet. That's the scary thing. But it's not a bad thing. So just because our students are not always going to be with us every single day, that doesn't mean that we cannot motivate and engage them in our lessons. It means we're able to motivate them more by harnessing the power of intrinsic motivation. So here are some things to consider, because our next couple lessons, the flipped classroom model and our tech tools, are really what we're going to use to build these lessons. So if it's still not making sense to you now, like, don't worry. Hopefully by the end of this PD class, it will. Okay. And so that brings us to our another big question. How are we going to do this, right? So think of intrinsic motivation as a foundation for structuring instruction. So we're going to add in some of these foundational blocks into our lesson. Yeah, so we're going to add some of these building blocks right into our lesson. That will hopefully make things a little bit easier, because I think the more we try to impose control over kids, whether that's through remote learning or in the classroom, they're just not going to want to engage with it as much as if we start changing up some of the structure of our lessons. So this will definitely go with the flipped classroom model, which is our next unit. Awesome, yay. So here we will explore the design of the class in the lessons. And what I'll point out is that I think the flipped classroom model works the best just because it gives us that flexibility that we so desperately need right now, whether we're in class or online. And I'll definitely explain more about that later. Okay, and I mentioned this a couple of times, but it's super, super important. And not even with school, just about with everything. Like, think about it. Have you ever been told to do something just to do it? And you're like, well, why? Why is it important? Why do we need to do it? Well, that's what your students are wondering too. Like, explain the why all the time. Even if you know it so well, you think it's obvious. It's not always obvious to your students. Explain why. Why is this lesson important? Why do you need to use it in real life? How does it apply to you now? To get them thinking about the content. Also, when you're learning something new, all of us do this. You rely on your prior knowledge to learn when you are learning something new because that's how you make those connections. So if you really start explaining this a lot, it's going to help. Another big thing is building time for reflection. Now, personally, I'm a writer. I love to write, and it helps, like, especially if I'm learning something new and I've read a whole bunch of different articles. Like, I'll, kind of write down my ideas about it and, it solidifies it. So, building in time for reflection over the content and the lessons is also really going to help and increase feedback. So this is a big one, just because from what I've talked about with the traditional class, you don't get the feedback till like after you've gotten the grade, and by then it's too late. So some of the students might be thinking, okay, like what's the point? I didn't understand it. Now we have to move on. But if you're structuring your lessons in a way that when students are working on their project or their schoolwork and you're there to help them, guide them, give them that feedback, before they get the grade, that's going to motivate them a lot more than if they've just done something at home, they come and turn it in, you give them that grade and they're like, okay, well, I didn't understand X, Y, and Z, but I already get the grade, so like, what's the point? So having feedback throughout the process is really going to help with motivation. And also more project-based and problem-based learning. So this can come in the form of just giving kids a way to work with the material and apply what they know. And it doesn't have to be anything big, can just be something small, or just giving them really good questions to answer, like in the form of a problem. So that's one thing we'll talk about later, is turning your lesson objectives into student-friendly questions that you give the kids a way to answer. And that will also help them really engage with the material. And then after we talk about flipped classroom, we're also going to explore some dandy technology tools that are going to help us to reach these goals. So I hope y'all enjoyed the lesson. Feel free to ask your questions in the comments, or you can always give me a private message or a private comment if there's something that you really want to know more about or something you still don't understand. Like, one of the biggest points in this class is to have good class discussion, and so that you all can really start thinking about the material too. So I hope y'all enjoyed the lesson. Thank you.